very warm welcome to the teaching for the Parish Evangelization cells. And this is the 70th teaching. And the theme I have chosen is a portrait of the parish, the cell and the early church. And it is based on the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 2, verse 42. And I'm going to read. And they were devoting themselves to the teaching of the apostles and the fellowship, the breaking of the bread, and the prayers. In the Acts of the Apostles, in chapter 2, verse 42, we find a description of immediate, constant, and persistent follow-up or follow-through care of the first converts or the newly baptized in the fledgling Church of Jerusalem. It covers 4 unwavering activities or patterns of behavior, namely the teaching of the apostles, the fellowship, the breaking of the bread, and the prayers. Let us unpack these 4 unwavering activities of the early church. The teaching of the apostles. The teaching, didahei, is to be distinguished from proclamation, keirugma, that the apostles made as they bore witness, testimony to Christ's death and resurrection. And also from another word, catechesis, katechesis, which is instruction given to catechumens, namely to those undergoing training and instruction preparatory to baptism. It seems rather surprising for me that while in Luke's Gospel we find a clear description of the content of Jesus' teaching, nowhere in Acts does Luke gives us a clear description of what was taught by the apostles to the new converts. However, from the Gospel and Acts, we can say that this phrase, the teaching of the apostles, probably included oral explanations by the apostles in faithful continuity to Jesus' saying and doing to outsiders of 1. The nature of salvation, the person and work of Christ, the commands of Christ, and other features of Christian life, and the message of the kingdom. As we all know, the first converts, the early Christians, did not have the New Testament as we do. They had only the Old Testament. Therefore, it was vitally important for them to devote themselves to the apostles' teaching, because it was through that teaching that they would learn about Christ and about how to follow him. That same teaching was later written down and became the New Testament. The apostles' teaching is essential, is the basis of our Christian doctrine, our Christian faith, and is the reason why Christ followers are called disciples, learners, mathetai, in the Acts Now, let us come to this word, to the second word, fellowship, koinonia, which means, it's a comprehensive term, means community, common life, common sharing, communion, intimacy, close bond, close association, partnership, unity, friendship. I call it a comprehensive term. Now, this word fellowship, used only once, as far as I can remember, in Luke's Gospel and Acts, is practically expressed, incarnated in the breaking of the bread and the prayers. We move to this phrase, the third phrase, the breaking of the bread. The breaking of the bread refers more than simply the sharing of the regular, common fellowship meals in houses, which we find in the Acts of the Apostles, which were subsequently developed into the agape, or love feast, as described in Paul's first letter to the Corinthians in chapter 11, verses 20-21. It seems to be the former reference to celebration of the Lord's Supper, as we find it again in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 16. The bread that we break, it can indeed be considered as the technical phrase for the Eucharist in both Luke's Gospel and his Acts. House fellowships were common in the early church. Later, they developed into house churches, and the house churches were and are the forerunners of the parish evangelization cells, the cellular churches. In Corinth, there had been times when the whole church met probably in a large house of a wealthy Christian, where unbelievers were also present. But there were smaller churches that met, for example, in the house of Aquila and Priscilla in Ephesus. This is, again, we find this description in 1 Corinthians 16:19. We come now to the last pillar, mark of the early church, the prayers. What do we mean by the prayers? The prayers could echo the set times of the Jerusalem temple, and also times when they pray together on their own as a community. Did the early Christians, perhaps you might ask, did the early Christians use the Lord's Prayer during these times, during these early times? As far as I know, it's not certain. However, we know that by the 2nd century, they were using it. In fact, the Didache, or Didache, or the teaching of the Lord by the 12 apostles, a 1st century short, early Christian manual on morals and church practice, recommended the use of the Lord's Prayer 3 times a day. Now, what is my question for you as parish cells, evangelization cells? The early church sets a benchmark and backbone for the structure of both the parish life and cell. When we compare our parish of Holy Innocents and the cell with the early church, what do we see? Do we see these inseparable 4 marks of the early church? These 4 go together. You cannot separate them or leave one out without damaging the whole portrait. God bless.